The sky over the steppe is black and endless. Searchlights claw at the darkness, their beams cutting white scars through drifting clouds. Somewhere above, the low hum of engines fades, then vanishes entirely. Silence. The German sentries along the Kuban River freeze, rifles raised, straining to hear. Then, from the stillness, a faint whisper emerges, a soft hiss of air over canvas wings, like broomsticks sweeping through the night. Seconds later, the ground erupts. Bombs tumble from invisible shapes above, each one landing with a hollow, distant thud. The men dive for cover, shouting a single word that spreads through the trenches like panic itself. Nachthexen, the night witches. They had appeared out of nowhere, slow, fragile aircraft made of wood and fabric, barely faster than a truck. The Germans mocked them at first, calling them pests, an insult to the very idea of war. But mockery turned to fear when they realized these women would not stop coming. They flew every night, in every season, in storms and moonlight and freezing fog, engines cutting out just before the bombs fell. You couldn't see them. You couldn't hear them. You could only wait for the next silence, and hope it wasn't yours. They flew biplanes so light they could lift from muddy pastures. Their cockpits were open to the wind. There were no radios, no armor, and often no parachutes. They carried just enough fuel for the round trip and a few small bombs tied beneath their wings. Yet, between 1942 and 1945, they flew more than 20,000 combat sorties. They hit supply depots, bridges, and encampments. They disrupted rest and denied sleep. What began as an experiment in desperation became one of the most effective psychological weapons of the war. Hit subscribe and like the video. You won't want to miss what comes next. By the end of this story, you'll understand how a regiment of young women in open-cockpit biplanes turned ridicule into terror, and why German soldiers would whisper that even the darkness belonged to them. Their official name was the 588th Night Bomber Regiment of the Soviet Air Force, but they called themselves simply the Girls of the Night. Teenagers, students, factory workers, women who had begged to be allowed to fight. When the invasion of the Soviet Union began in 1941, the Red Army had been shattered. Entire divisions were lost in weeks. The front burned from Leningrad to the Black Sea. In that chaos, one woman stood before Stalin himself and demanded something unthinkable, that women be allowed to fly combat missions. Her name was Mariya Raskova, a famed aviator, record breaker, and national hero, often called the Russian Amelia Earhart. She argued that women could do more than build munitions or tend hospitals. They could fight. Stalin, desperate for both morale and manpower, agreed. 3 all-female regiments were approved: a fighter unit, a dive bomber unit, and a night bomber regiment commanded by a calm, strict officer named Yevdokiya Bershanskaya. The aircraft they were given was a relic of another era, the Polikarpov Po-2, later renamed the Po-2. It had been designed as a trainer and crop duster, a plane so slow it could barely outpace a car. Yet it was stable, simple to repair, and capable of landing almost anywhere. The women stripped everything unnecessary to lighten the load. Radios, guns, even parachutes were often left behind to make room for extra bombs. They flew by compass, by starlight, by instinct. To the men at the front, it looked like madness, sending young women into black skies in machines that could ignite with a single tracer round. To the women, it was freedom. They were finally trusted to fight for their country. And as they began their first missions in 1942, the Germans discovered that madness could be deadly. The night witches didn't come once or twice. They came in waves. 2, 3, sometimes 10 sorties per pilot in a single night. When one returned to refuel, another lifted off. The rhythm never stopped. The soldiers below couldn't rest, couldn't predict, couldn't hide. Searchlights burned through the sky, but the biplanes were too small, too slow to track. Anti-aircraft guns over-rotated, firing ahead of their speed. The witches moved like ghosts, gliding silently until the moment the bombs fell, and then vanishing back into the dark. By dawn, they were gone. What they left behind was fear, exhaustion, and a growing realization among German troops that they were fighting an enemy who didn't sleep. In a war defined by tanks, rockets, and steel, these women fought with linen wings and lantern maps. Their weapon was persistence. Their courage was ordinary only in that it never faltered. They flew wood and canvas, and they would not stop coming. The German night was never truly dark again. From the Baltic coast to the Caucasus, sentries flinched at every shift of wind through the trees. They had learned to fear what they couldn't see, the soft rustle that meant engines had been cut, that bombs were already falling. Summer 1941 had ripped the heart from the Soviet Air Force. Luftwaffe columns moved almost unchecked across Ukraine and Belarus, burning airfields and scattering what planes survived. Within months, the Red Army had lost most of its trained pilots and a generation of aircraft. But where the Army saw disaster, one aviator saw a chance to rebuild differently. Mariya Raskova had been famous long before the war. A record-setting pilot, the first woman to become a navigator in the Soviet Air Force, a symbol of what Stalin called the new Soviet woman. When Operation Barbarossa began, she drove straight to Moscow and demanded an audience with the Kremlin. Her proposal was radical: form 3 all-female aviation regiments, 1 fighter, 1 dive bomber, 1 night bomber, commanded, maintained, and crewed entirely by women. Stalin approved. He needed pilots, and he needed symbols. By October 1941, recruiting posters went up across Soviet cities calling for girls with flight school certificates, Komsomol badges, or simply courage. They arrived in wool coats and hand-stitched boots, barely out of school, clutching logbooks and photographs of heroes. The Army gave them men's uniforms, several sizes too large, cut down trousers to fit, and sent them to Engels Air Base on the Volga. There they met their commander, Major Yevdokiya Bershanskaya, small, calm, strict. Her eyes missed nothing. Under her watch, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment was born. The women trained in bitter cold, flying obsolete trainers that leaked oil and rattled apart under stress. They learned to strip engines, patch bullet holes, and land in darkness using only the outline of rivers as guides. Their aircraft was the Polikarpov Po-2, a biplane of plywood and linen, slow, fragile, open to the wind. At full throttle, it barely reached 150 kilometers an hour. In daylight, it was a target. At night, it became invisible. They carried no radios, often no parachutes, and relied on pocket compasses and memorized terrain sketches. Weight was the enemy. Every kilogram removed meant another kilogram of bombs. The men laughed when they saw them preparing to deploy. Girls in oversized flight suits climbing into machines that looked stolen from a flying club. "You'll never survive the front," they said. The women answered only by flying. They practiced until their hands bled, taking off and landing by lantern light, engine noise echoing across the frozen airfield. Bershanskaya drilled them in formation flying, target approach, and silent glides. When fatigue dropped one pilot, another climbed into her cockpit without question. Within months, they were ready. In the spring of 1942, the order came. The regiment was to deploy to the southern front, near the Caucasus. Their mission: to harass German supply lines at night, destroy depots, bridges, and encampments, and never give the enemy rest. They would fly wood and canvas into a sky owned by Messerschmitts. They would do it without armor, without radios, without sleep. And they would not stop coming. The base at Engels smelled of fuel and cold iron. Snow drifted between the hangars as rows of canvas-covered wings shimmered under lantern light. The recruits of the 588 Night Bomber Regiment were still learning to call themselves soldiers. Most were teenagers, Komsomol girls who had never seen the front, some who had never even flown at night. They cut their hair short, stitched their own gloves, and learned to navigate by feel, not by instruments. The wind would be their map, the stars their compass, and silence their shield. Training at Engels was unforgiving. The instructors treated them as any male cadet, no special allowances. They learned to strip a Po-2 engine in darkness, to patch torn fabric with glue that froze solid in their hands, to fly blind through winter fog until their eyelashes iced over. One pilot later wrote, "We stopped feeling fear when we stopped feeling our fingers." Each cockpit was open to the elements. No canopy, no heat, no armor. The Po-2 was barely more than a frame wrapped in linen and wood. At night, frost glazed the instruments, oil turned to sludge, and the roar of the Shvetsov engine filled the air until, with a twist of the throttle, it cut to silence, the moment they called the glide. In that instant, the world narrowed to a heartbeat and the whisper of wind. They flew without radios to save weight. They used red pencils to mark maps, memorizing river bends and railway spurs. The navigators, often younger than their pilots, hunched over compasses and stopwatch timers, whispering coordinates through the slipstream. Landing lights were forbidden. A single spark could draw artillery fire. They touched down on dark fields by judging shadows against moonlight. The base ran on exhaustion and discipline. Mechanics, also women, worked through the night, their hands black with oil. They loaded bombs by hand, checked bolts, fueled tanks from drums rolled through mud. The rhythm never stopped. Land, reload, refuel, fly. Coffee was replaced with black bread, sleep with routine. A full night meant 8, sometimes 12 sorties. Commander Yevdokiya Bershanskaya enforced perfection without raising her voice. She kept a ledger of every sortie, every crash, every repair. If one crew failed to return, she ordered the next pair into the air. There was no sentiment, only continuity. Her calm precision held the regiment together through losses that might have broken others. They joked grimly that their planes were made of percal and courage. The humor was armor. Behind it, they understood what waited ahead: searchlights, flak, cold that killed as efficiently as bullets. Yet in those long nights of training, a quiet pride grew among them. They were not an experiment anymore. They were a weapon being sharpened. When spring thawed the Volga, orders came down from Moscow. The 588th would transfer south to the front. They packed their few belongings: flight jackets, wool scarves, photographs of home, and climbed into the same planes they had learned to fear and love. Engines coughed to life, sending ripples across the frozen airfield. They rose into the dawn in staggered pairs, fragile silhouettes against the red horizon. Ahead lay the Caucasus, and with it, the war they had been waiting to fight. Their first mission came with the smell of mud and oil drifting up from the Kuban plains. It was the spring of 1942, and the German advance had reached deep into southern Russia. The skies belonged to the Luftwaffe, but the nights, those would soon belong to someone else. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment arrived in battered trucks, unloading crates of bombs and toolkits beside a field barely wide enough for takeoff. There were no hangars, no radios, only the hum of mosquitoes and distant artillery. The women pitched tents beside their planes and painted the tail numbers by hand. When darkness fell, they pulled on sheepskin coats and flight goggles already cracked with frost. Each aircraft carried 2 women, a pilot and a navigator. Their names would later become legend: Popova, Rudneva, Sebrova. But that first night, they were simply terrified. They were flying untested, underarmed, and outnumbered 1,000 to 1. At 2200, the order came through. 3 pairs of Po-2 biplanes were to strike a German supply depot near the front line. The engines roared to life, rattling like kettles about to boil. Then, one by one, the fragile planes lifted into the dark, wheels brushing the grass before vanishing into cloud. Inside the cockpits, the air was knife-cold. Wind clawed at scarves and gloves. The only light came from the faint green glow of a compass dial. Navigators leaned over maps that flapped in the slipstream, counting seconds and river bends until they reached the drop zone. At 500 meters, the pilots throttled back. The engines coughed once, then fell silent. The sudden stillness was terrifying. No sound but wind over the wings, no horizon but the moonlit haze of the earth below. From the ground, German searchlights swept the sky, slow and deliberate, looking for the noise that wasn't there. One plane dipped its wings, drawing the beams of light upward. The others glided through the dark on either side, releasing their bombs in perfect silence. Seconds later, explosions tore through the depot, crates, fuel drums, and tents blossoming into fire. The pilots banked sharply, diving for cover among the clouds. Engines sputtered back to life, dragging them away before the gunners could recalibrate. The Germans had never seen anything like it. They called them Nachthexen, night witches, because the sound of the wind over their wings reminded them of broomsticks. Some soldiers swore that women must have supernatural sight to find their targets in the dark. Others simply stopped sleeping. By dawn, the women returned to base, faces gray with exhaustion. They climbed from the cockpits, their hands trembling from cold, and began to help the mechanics reload the planes. Bershanskaya moved down the line with her notebook, checking damage, marking sortie counts, saying little. That night's success set the pattern for the years ahead. Each mission was short, brutal, repetitive. They'd fly in pairs or trios, 1 to bait the searchlights, 2 to glide in unseen. They'd cut engines at the edge of enemy lines, glide silently, drop bombs by feel, and climb back into darkness. The Germans soon realized they could not rest, not even for a moment. Their searchlights stayed on all night. Their gunners fired at shadows until their barrels overheated. Every gust of wind became a warning. Every night was a new attack. The night witches had arrived, and they were nowhere, and everywhere, at once. The rhythm of their war was measured not in days, but in nights. The sun belonged to others, the tanks, the heavy bombers, the armies that advanced in daylight. But when darkness fell, the sky became theirs alone. Each evening began the same way. The smell of kerosene and cold metal filling the air as mechanics, girls with oil-blackened hands, rolled bombs under the wings and checked every bolt by flashlight. The pilots gathered around a map spread across an ammunition crate while Commander Bershanskaya gave the night's brief. Targets varied: an ammunition train, a bridge, a German bivouac. but the method never changed. Small bombs, dropped precisely, over and over, until the enemy could no longer sleep. The Po-2s lifted off in pairs, the wheels brushing grass before disappearing into the dark. Each sortie lasted less than half an hour. They would glide to the target, drop their bombs, and return to refuel, again and again until the horizon began to pale. Inside the cockpits, the air bit through leather gloves. There were no heaters, no oxygen tanks, no radios to call for help. Navigators read the land by starlight, the shape of a river bend, the pattern of a tree line, the faint glimmer of a road. When clouds swallowed the moon, they flew blind, trusting the rhythm of the engine and the stopwatch ticking against their thighs. The cycle became mechanical, almost ritual. Land, refuel, reload, fly. Some nights they flew 8 sorties, some 12. Between runs they drank hot water thick with soot, scribbled quick notes about damage or fuel pressure, then climbed right back in. Sleep came in fragments. 10 minutes in a chair, head against the cockpit rim. They learned to treat fatigue like weather, something to endure, not something to beat. Navigator Yevgenia Rudneva wrote home, "We live between darkness and dawn. When I measure the stars for navigation, I feel like I'm measuring our courage." She would later die in 1944, but her words became a kind of prayer. The enemy learned, too. German troops began timing their watches to the moments of silence before a strike. That eerie pause when the engines were cut and only the wind whispered overhead. They would crouch in trenches, staring up at a sky that gave no warning until the bombs fell. One Wehrmacht report admitted, "They do not let us sleep." Their tactics are madness, but their precision is art. For the night witches, that was victory. Sleep denial was their weapon, exhaustion their strategy. They couldn't match German tonnage or technology, but they could unnerve, unsettle, and break rhythm. The one thing every army depends on. Sometimes the women returned with frostbitten cheeks and blood frozen in their gloves. Sometimes they didn't return at all, yet the next pair always lifted off. Bershanskaya's discipline left no room for grief until morning. Losses were recorded, replacements assigned, engines restarted. By the winter of 1943, their reputation had spread through both armies. Soviet infantry cheered when they heard the distant buzz of Po-2 engines, a sound that meant the Germans would not rest that night. To the enemy, that same sound meant dread. Every night was a repetition of the same act of courage. 2 women in an open cockpit, gliding through blackness with bombs that barely dented the earth but slowly crushed the spirit of those who waited below. The rhythm never changed. Night after night, mission after mission. The sky belonged to the witches. Faces began to emerge from the darkness, names that would later become synonymous with endurance. Among them was Nadezhda Popova, a pilot whose laughter could cut through the cold and whose courage seemed bottomless. She flew so many sorties that her logbooks blurred into nights without end. Once, after her plane returned with 42 bullet holes, she simply patted the fuselage and said, "She's tired, but she'll fly again." Her navigator that night, Yevgenia Rudneva, was an astronomy student before the war. She used to joke that she'd gone from measuring stars to measuring darkness. Her letters home read like poetry. "The sky here is alive," she wrote. "It hums, it burns, and it remembers everything." When she was killed in 1944, her comrades said they still felt her presence whenever the stars were bright. Then there was Irina Sibrova, known for flying more than 1,000 missions, a record even male pilots rarely reached. Polina Gelman, Olga Sanfirova, Tatyana Makarova, each became a fragment of a larger legend. They were not superheroes, though their endurance made them seem that way. They were ordinary women who learned to live with the knowledge that every flight might be their last. At the center of it all stood Yevdokiya Bershanskaya, the regiment's commander. She was neither loud nor sentimental. She ruled by quiet authority, keeping strict logs of every plane, every bomb, every casualty. When losses came, she didn't make speeches. She simply said, "Tomorrow we fly again." Her system was brutal but effective. By constantly rotating crews, varying routes, and enforcing precision timing, she kept survival rates higher than anyone thought possible. The ground crews, all women, were as vital as those in the air. They refueled planes with hand pumps, loaded bombs by flashlight, and crawled under wings slick with frost to hammer dents back into shape. When a sortie returned, they swarmed like surgeons around a patient, patching bullet holes with doped fabric, replacing spark plugs, tightening bolts. Often, the same plane that landed at midnight would be back in the air by 1. Their world existed between exhaustion and adrenaline. In summer, mosquitoes bit through flight suits. In winter, frost built up so thick that gauges froze solid. Yet, no one complained. They believed that each successful sortie meant one fewer German soldier would sleep soundly, one fewer bridge carrying supplies eastward. The camaraderie among them was as fierce as their discipline. They shared food, laughter, and letters under the same dim bulbs that illuminated repair pits. When one crew didn't return, the others cleaned her bunk before dawn and took off again without ceremony. The grief came later, in silence, during those brief moments when engines cooled and the world stood still. Even as the war ground on, the Night Witch's efficiency astonished commanders. Their mission success rates climbed higher than many male bomber regiments. They hit targets the heavy bombers couldn't reach, slipping through narrow valleys or flying low under radar to strike hidden depots. But what truly set them apart wasn't just their skill, it was their relentlessness. They didn't possess the luxury of fear or hesitation. When engines sputtered or maps tore in the wind, they trusted instinct. When anti-aircraft shells burst around them, they flew through the smoke. They had begun as volunteers, students, daughters, dreamers. But by 1943, they were veterans of a kind the world had never seen. Women who turned fabric and wood into vengeance, who made the night itself their weapon. By then, even the Luftwaffe pilots, trained in precision and pride, had learned to respect them. One German report called the Po-2 the most annoying plane on the Eastern Front. Another admitted, "It is impossible to shoot down what you cannot catch." The Germans still called them witches. The women preferred a simpler word, aviators. By 1943, the regiment had become a constant presence above the Southern Front. Their base moved forward with each Soviet advance, first the Kuban, then Crimea, then the flatlands of the Taman Peninsula. Wherever the Red Army pushed, the Night Witches followed, a whisper before the storm. The Germans had learned to dread them. Field reports complained of continuous harassment by low-flying biplanes and unbearable fatigue among troops. Officers forbade smoking outdoors after dark. One flicker of flame could reveal a position. Soldiers set up decoy fires to draw the bombers away, but the women learned to read the deception, the difference between an empty field and a living camp. Their tactics had evolved into choreography. 3 planes lifted off together. One flew low, engine roaring, to draw the searchlights. The second climbed to distract the gunners. The third cut its engine and slipped through the dark to release its bombs. Sometimes they traded roles mid-air. The coordination was wordless, practiced through instinct and repetition. Over the Kuban and Crimea, the nights were long and merciless. The women flew through tracer fire so thick it looked like a woven curtain. The explosions of flak rocked their fragile biplanes, tearing holes through fabric wings. When a plane didn't return, Bershanskaya's ledger recorded it with a single word: missing. The next sortie left on time. They learned to fly lower, slower, closer. The Po-2's engine, a sputtering Shvetsov M11, was a paradox. It was weak, but it never quit. Even with one cylinder shot out, it could limp home. Its very fragility became its armor. The Luftwaffe's night fighters, designed to chase bombers 4 times faster, often overshot their targets. The Po-2 could turn inside a radius no German plane could match. Many escaped simply because they were too slow to kill. During the Taman campaign of late 1943, the regiment reached its peak. The women flew hundreds of sorties a night, sometimes landing every 20 minutes to refuel. Ammunition dumps burned for days. Rail lines disappeared under smoke. German field hospitals reported rising numbers of sleepless soldiers suffering nervous collapse. The front was collapsing too, and the night witches were the unseen pressure behind it. When the Soviet Army finally secured the Taman Peninsula, Stalin awarded the regiment Guard status, the highest honor a Soviet unit could receive. From then on, they were the 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment. Taman. They wore the new insignia with pride but little celebration. There was no time for ceremony. The war still moved west, and so did they. The women had grown hardened, but not indifferent. They buried comrades at dawn, marking graves with propeller blades, then took off again at dusk. Their laughter still filled the mess tents. Their songs still carried across the airfields. To survive that long in the dark required something more than courage. It required rhythm, trust, and a kind of stubborn joy. By winter, the enemy no longer mocked them. German intelligence briefings warned of their tactics, calling them highly disciplined and extremely persistent. The term Nachthexen remained, but now it was spoken with weary respect. The witches had turned the night itself into a weapon, and the front line into their canvas. They had begun as an experiment. Now they were a legend. Speed and altitude had defined the air war for years, but the night witches had rewritten the rules. Their advantage was the very thing every engineer despised: the Po-2's frailty. The biplane's top speed was barely 150 kilometers an hour, its stall speed just under 80. Anti-aircraft gunners relied on predictor sights calibrated for faster bombers. The Po-2s simply slipped beneath the calculations. Shells burst high above them while they floated through the blind spot between radar and horizon. At low altitude, the roar of their tiny engines blended with the wind. When the pilots cut power and glided, the plane became almost invisible, the only sound a faint sigh of fabric against air. German night fighters had no answer. Messerschmitts and Junkers planes, built for speed, tore through the sky too fast to turn tightly enough for a shot. When they did score a hit, it was usually by luck, a burst of flak that shredded linen and wood. Yet even then, the little Po-2s often limped home, patched by dawn with canvas and glue. Their tactics became a kind of physics lesson in misdirection. 2 aircraft flew decoy patterns over expected targets, drawing tracers and searchlights upward. A third drifted silently along the tree line, releasing bombs by hand over ammunition dumps and bridges. Each mission was a balance between gravity and nerve. Pull up too early and miss. Wait too long and the ground reached back. The women studied the weaknesses of modern defenses with the focus of mathematicians. They learned how to use terrain to break radar beams. how to ride thermals to save fuel, how to follow rivers that gleamed faintly even on moonless nights. They used the gliding descent not only to hide, but to feel their way through darkness, the wind changing pitch just before trees or power lines rose beneath them. Exposure was their constant enemy. In open cockpits, the temperature plunged to 30 below zero. Frostbite stiffened fingers around control sticks, engine oil congealed like tar, and bullets turned fabric to ribbons. They countered with ingenuity, stuffing newspapers inside coats, wrapping scarves around goggles to keep them from freezing. Before takeoff, mechanics lit small fires under the engines to warm them enough to start. When snow buried their airstrips, they carved runways with shovels and gasoline cans. When fog hid the horizon, they flew anyway. There was no word in Bershanskaya's vocabulary for cancelled. The Po-2s were never designed for combat, yet in their hands they became the perfect guerrilla aircraft. They could land on dirt roads, refuel from barrels, and lift off again in under 2 minutes. No radio, no armor, no chance, and somehow, no equal. The German command began assigning night fighter crews specifically to hunt them, promising the Iron Cross to any pilot who downed one. Few succeeded. As one frustrated officer wrote in his report, "It is impossible to shoot down what you cannot find, and by the time you hear them, they are already gone." Slow, fragile, and built from wood, the Po-2 should never have survived the war. But in the hands of the night witches, it became a paradox. A ghost that technology could not touch, proof that bravery could outfly design. Winter turned the sky into glass. The airfields froze solid, the metal cracked in the cold, and the Po-2s looked more like relics than weapons. The women wrapped scarves over their faces until only their eyes showed, and still the frost crept through the fabric. They took off with engines warmed by bonfires, the smell of smoke clinging to their flight suits. Up there, the temperature could kill faster than flak. Oil froze inside the cylinders, breath turned to ice across goggles. Sometimes their maps stiffened mid-flight and had to be broken along the folds. But nothing stopped the rhythm. One crew would land with frostbitten hands, and another would take their place before the wheels had cooled. Their discipline became instinct. Every motion, buckling straps, testing throttle, cutting the engine, had to be perfect. They had long since learned that mistakes didn't forgive. There were no parachutes for comfort, only a shared understanding. If the plane went down, you finished your mission on foot, or not at all. Even sleep followed its own pattern. Short bursts between sorties, faces pressed into arms, the smell of fuel thick in the air. Some wrote letters home that began the same way. "We are alive." Nothing more needed saying. When fog blanketed the ground, they flew by feel. When flak blinded the horizon, they counted seconds between bursts to measure distance. It was less flying than surviving. Yet the pride of precision never left them. They could strike a supply line, a convoy, a command post, and vanish before the echo faded. In winter, silence carried farther. The Germans learned to listen for it, the sudden hush before the glide. That quiet became their terror. Entire units reported sleeplessness. The women called it the sound of fear. They carried small rituals against the cold. A strip of wool tied around a wrist for luck. A coin sewn into a glove. Popova often carried a photograph of her brother, who'd been killed at Stalingrad. She said he flew with her every night. Others tucked folded letters under their flight caps. Faith came in fragments. By 1944, their skills were pure instinct. They could find a bridge in total darkness, bomb it, and return without a compass. They could land on a frozen road no wider than a riverbank. They joked that they had become half ghosts, visible only when fire lit their wings. The war was shifting west. New airfields awaited in Belarus and Poland. The women packed their things in crates, said goodbye to the fields that had buried their dead, and took off once more into the dark. Frost still clung to their planes, but they carried the warmth of something stronger than heat, the certainty that the night belonged to them. By the spring of 1944, the front had moved westward, and the night witches followed like a shadow that never lifted. Their Po-2s now took off from muddy fields in Belarus, then Poland, then the edge of Germany itself. They flew deeper into enemy territory than ever before, through smoke, sleet, and tracer fire, and always at night. The tactics were the same, but the scale was larger. Entire squadrons operated in waves, overlapping their sorties so that the enemy never knew when one raid ended and the next began. Ammunition trains derailed. Bridges over the Oder went up in fire. German divisions reported whole nights without rest, soldiers shooting at ghosts until their guns overheated. The Po-2s no longer surprised anyone, but they still could not be stopped. German command had issued standing orders: fire on any engine noise at night. Yet the sound they feared most wasn't the drone of the engine. It was the silence that came after it cut out. That was when the women were already overhead, gliding through darkness, unseen until the first explosion. Even Allied airmen began to hear stories of them. The Soviet women who flew without lights, who landed on dirt roads, who could navigate by a sliver of moonlight. Few ever met them, but their legend spread through camps like rumor that they never missed, never hesitated, and never seemed to sleep. As the Red Army crossed into Poland, the 46th Guards Taman Regiment carried out raids that crippled retreating convoys and supply hubs. Their small bombs, dropped with surgical precision, cleared paths for armored columns to move by day. They were no longer auxiliary support. They were the forward pulse of the offensive. By early 1945, they were flying near the Oder River, striking German positions ahead of the final push toward Berlin. They'd take off before midnight and return after dawn, faces cracked by windburn and ice, eyes bloodshot from the glare of flak bursts. Mechanics met them on the runway with tea that froze in cups before it could be drunk. Engines were refueled while still hot. The smell of gasoline mixed with the smoke of distant artillery. The Luftwaffe, desperate and fragmented, still tried to catch them. One report described a German pilot emptying his guns into the dark, only to see nothing but falling snow. Another admitted that the Po-2s possess a peculiar invulnerability. Our machines are too fast. When Soviet tanks rolled westward toward the Reich, the witches flew above them, marking crossings, scattering troops, burning depots. Their bomb loads were small, but their precision made them indispensable. The German soldiers had begun to whisper again, using the old name, Nachthexen. It no longer sounded like mockery. It sounded like surrender. Each night, when the last sortie landed, the airfield went silent except for the ticking of cooling engines. The women climbed from their cockpits, shaking snow from their shoulders, and looked east toward the faint line of dawn. They had outlasted everything: the mockery, the cold, the odds. And now, the horizon of home was drawing near. By the last months of the war, their names filled both Soviet commendations and German reports. The 46th Guards Taman Regiment had flown more sorties than any other night bomber unit on the Eastern Front. Tens of thousands of missions across 3 relentless years. They had bombed ammunition trains, fuel depots, bridges, and convoys from the Caucasus to the Oder. And for every destroyed target, there was a price. Each airfield carried its own small graveyard. crosses made from propeller blades, helmets placed over sticks, names scratched into wood that weather soon erased. Losses were quiet, acknowledged with a moment of stillness before the next flight. They buried their dead before dusk and took off again by nightfall. There was no other way to fight. By May 1945, victory was within sight. In the final push into Germany, the regiment continued flying nightly raids, dropping small bombs over railway stations and enemy encampments. The women who had started as recruits barely out of school were now seasoned veterans, calm, methodical, unshaken by gunfire. They no longer counted missions. There were simply nights, and the next one. When the war finally ended, the order came down abruptly. No more flights, no more targets. Engines were shut down one last time, the familiar sputter giving way to silence that felt unnatural. Some of the women cried without knowing why. Others simply stared at their planes, unsure what to do with hands that had not stopped moving in years. The regiment's record was staggering. More than 23,000 sorties. Over 3,000 tons of bombs dropped. Dozens of bridges destroyed. Depots burned. Enemy positions erased. Yet their greatest achievement was endurance itself. A persistence that broke the rhythm of an army far larger and better equipped. For their service, 23 of them were awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honor. Commander Yevdokiya Bershanskaya received the Order of Suvorov, the only woman in the Soviet Air Force to do so. Their recognition came quietly. The front had shifted to peace, and there was little room left for stories of night and smoke. Yet among those who had fought beside them, their legend remained intact. Soviet infantrymen said they could sleep only when they heard the familiar buzz of Po-2s overhead, knowing their enemies would not. German survivors would later admit that the fear of them lingered long after the fighting stopped. The night witches had turned ridicule into respect. They had flown machines made of canvas and wood against a mechanized empire, and prevailed through discipline, precision, and willpower. Their weapon was not firepower, but relentlessness. They fought a war of attrition against sleep itself, and they won. When the regiment was finally disbanded in October 1945, their planes were left lined up on the edge of an airfield in Poland, wings drooping under morning dew. The women saluted them one last time, climbed aboard trucks, and drove east toward a country they had helped to save. They had been called many things: witches, ghosts, miracles. But to themselves, they were just aviators who refused to stop flying. When peace finally settled across Europe, it came so quietly that many of them didn't believe it. The night sky, which had roared and burned for years, was suddenly empty. The sound that had once meant purpose, the drone of the Po-2's engine, the rush of air past fabric wings, vanished into memory. The 46th Guards, Taman Night Bomber Regiment, was disbanded that October. The women packed their flight suits, rolled up maps worn soft by use, and left the airfields that had defined their youth. The planes stayed behind, rows of fragile silhouettes gleaming in the sunrise, too outdated for peacetime, too sacred to scrap. Many of them returned to ordinary lives. Some became teachers, engineers, or doctors. Others married quietly, raised children, and never spoke of what they had done. The medals they earned were tucked into drawers beside photographs that had yellowed around the edges. Years passed before anyone began to ask who they really were. When the stories finally surfaced, in memoirs, interviews, and fading letters, the world learned what the soldiers on both sides had always known: that these women had fought not for glory, but for endurance. They had taken machines meant for training and turned them into instruments of precision and fear. They had outlasted mockery, exhaustion, and the limits of human will. In old footage, you can still see their faces, young, wind-burned, laughing through fatigue. You can hear the creak of the wooden wings and the hiss of fabric slicing the night. They called them witches, but their magic was nothing supernatural. It was skill, patience, and courage repeated thousands of times until it changed the course of a war. Decades later, monuments rose in their honor. In Moscow, in Krasnodar, in tiny villages near the airfields they once called home. A few of them lived long enough to see it. Nadezhda Popova would stand before one of those statues and smile softly, saying, "We just did what we had to do." The night was ours, and perhaps that's the only way to end their story, not with triumph, but with quiet reverence. For when the world went dark, they flew into it. When the sky froze, they kept flying. And when history forgot them, the night remembered. They arrived with the darkness and left history with the dawn.